You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 70. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
This week, we're diving into exploring our grace stories. As leaders in the United Methodist tradition, we hold grace as a distinguishing mark of our theology. As you might recall, over the last 6 episodes, we've touched on the theme from each chapter of Galatians, a book of the Bible that points us to God's grace. So today we want to talk about the shaping stories around our experiences of grace in the hopes that you'll consider your grace stories and how you might invite others to do the same. So today we'll start with Prevenient grace. As we get started, let me remind you that this episode of LeaderCast is brought to you by the resources of Transforming Mission. We help you deepen your relationship with Christ, the congregation, and your local community. You can find resources for this episode at transformingmission.org/070. Okay, today, Prevenient grace. Probably sounds like an outdated word, and it is, because the only place you're likely to hear about it is in the United Methodist Church or in some Wesleyan traditions of the church. John Wesley's other favorite word for this season of grace was preventing, a word used in the 1700s, very differently than the way we use it today. So let's put it into some kind of context. The words prevenient or preventing come from a Latin word which means to precede. Prevenient or preventing grace then is simply the grace that comes before. And now the question is, before what? Well, justifying grace and sanctifying grace, or even understanding grace. It's the grace that comes before. We have a way maybe of sharing some of our understanding of prevenient grace. And Sarah, I think maybe you have a story for us.
I do, and it goes back to when I was making my way through the ordination process. And so I don't want you to hear this as a clergy story or prevenient grace is only for those who are seeking ordination. It's simply the context of this story. I was attending an interview with our district board, moving through the process towards ordination, and the interview committee gathered in a room in a local church, and they were seated in a circle sitting on standard Sunday school room chairs. And the room, as I remember it, was still decorated as if it were the 1970s. Now, this was early in the 2000s. An older gentleman seated in that circle with white hair and a chiseled face looked at me and said without a smile, "Why did you waste 6 years of your life working in higher education?" Now, I confess to you today, I was a bit taken aback by his question. His question seemed presumptuous at best, and at worst, it felt judgmental. But this was an interview, and so what do you do in an interview? You take a deep breath, and I answered the question as directly and as kindly as I could. And I said, pretty simply, I don't see those 6 years as a waste. I learned more in those 6 years about leadership and administration than I could have ever learned in seminary or from the local church. My work in life during that time took me to places in this country where I encountered something holy, and I began a journey of exploring faith, questioning faith, and learning about faith. God was at work in my life before I was aware of it. Part of what I found welcoming about the United Methodist Church was our understanding of grace. For me, it was a season of God's prevenient grace at work in my life. So I'm sorry. I don't think God wastes any of our experiences.
So part of what you're saying is, even though you had not fully understood God's grace, there was something that made you aware of God's grace or God's presence.
Right. At that moment in my journey, I could look back and see how God was working in my life through that whole season. And here was someone who was trying to dismiss that season as a waste. Now, to be honest, I really think that he was trying to provoke me to see how I would respond when provoked. I really think that's what was going on. But regardless of that, as I think about the question even being asked, there's a whole season of my life that if I didn't understand prevenient grace and that God was working through that time, preparing me for something that I would encounter, I might say there's a whole season of my life that was a waste. And I don't see it in that way at all. I don't see anyone's life and the experiences, whether we question why are we doing this at this moment. I think God uses all of those things. We don't always understand it, but I think God can use it all.
So before we step into what this might mean about leadership, any of us who have had an experience of God's love or God's grace, as we look back, we can see that how we articulate it is God was working in my life in ways that I may not have understood or didn't recognize at the time. Is that part of what we're talking about?
Yeah. Let me say it this way. Because my life experience includes a whole season of my life, my childhood and young adulthood, that I was not connected to a local church, or I wouldn't even consider myself a person of faith. For me, when I think about prevenient, justifying, and sanctifying grace, there is a very clear memory for me of what God's prevenient grace means and looks like. Because that was half of my life. So I can look back and say, I understand God's grace is God's love seeking us. And I can look back and tell you oodles of ways that God was pursuing me, and I was clueless in that moment. From neighborhood friends as a child, to high school friends and college student organizations who shared space with the student organization that I was a part of. Over and over and over again, God was seeking me. And my lack of response in each of those instances didn't stop God from continuing to use people and circumstances around me to pursue me, to show me his love, to meet me where I was. It was waiting for me to wake up to the fact of, hello, here I am. Are you ever going to notice me, Thomas? I've given you plenty of opportunities. Let's get on with this.
So when you finally woke up and understood and recognized it, you could look back and see how God had been doing that. At the moments that God was doing it, as you were growing up, you weren't aware of that. It's only after you look back and say, well, that's what God was doing.
Right. And as a child, I wasn't thinking, oh, God's trying to meet me. That's why my friends are inviting me to Vacation Bible School. I was thinking, oh, my friends have something to do at their church and they want me to come along because I'm one of their friends. And so I went. It didn't have anything to do with God, Jesus, or the church. It was my friends invited me in something. But when I look back on that, I talk about growing up on a street that I was surrounded by Roman Catholic and Lutheran and Baptist saints who invited me to worship and invited me to go to things like Vacation Bible School. And so there's a good reason why I'm now United Methodist, because I had those experiences, and then I found something very different in and through the United Methodist Church, which I would say would be the best part of each one of those. I can only say that looking back and seeing God's prevenient grace working in and through the people around me and the community that I was a part of. I couldn't have articulated it then, and that's part of how I think we know it's prevenient grace.
Well, I think one of the things that is meaningful for me in the tradition in which we find we express our faith in and through the church, is that none of this really depends on me.
Right.
This is all God's work. Even when I think, well, I made a decision, it's God's prompting that even gets me to the place of making a decision.
Right.
So it's not anything that I'm doing that finally wakes God up. It's, as you've already said, it's what God continues to do where I finally wake up.
Right.
So there may be other pieces of that we need to understand, but this is LeaderCast, and we're talking about the impact of grace on leadership. So what is the impact for leaders on understanding God's prevenient grace?
Well, let me tell you another story. When I was serving in a downtown ministry with people who found their homes on the streets, some of them were addicted to drugs and alcohol. Some were in and out of prison. You get the idea. I found myself saying over and over again to them, God loves you and there's nothing you can do about it. I think initially I said that because of the circumstances that they found in their lives. But the more that I said it, the more I realized it wasn't a message for people who were marginalized. It was a message for all of us. God loves you, and there's nothing you can do about it. So as a leader, if I truly believe that, I'm going to respond accordingly. And as I think about the journey that people are on and how we lead them, part of what I'm learning is that most people are doing the best they can. Who they are and who God created them to be isn't something for me to decide. My decision is around how I express God's love to all people. And when I don't, apologizing and asking for a do-over because, well, I'm human and so it happens. So if I believe in my core in God's prevenient grace, that causes me to pause and ask the question, how do I lead in response to that? And one of the ways that I've done that is by leading and using the words that I shared with you. God loves you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, hear me. Don't say that if you don't believe it, because you're not helping. Again, if I believe that God is seeking out each one of us and cares for each one of us and loves each one of us, whether we offer any love back, my role as a leader is to embody that love in the best way as I possibly can. Do I do it well all of the time? Nope. Again, because I'm human and I'm still growing in grace. So I'm sharing my story on prevenient grace. By the time we get to sanctifying, we're going to be talking to Tim and hearing his story.
Let me see if I can ask the question in the way that it's in my head, and that is, even though we're talking about prevenient grace, and we're going to talk about justifying grace the next episode and sanctifying grace the next one, this isn't really something that's linear.
No.
Sanctifying or the prevenient grace could be part of any process in which we're involved in, even though we may think we have already experienced God's grace in a transforming kind of way.
Right. And so the example for that I think of is there are experiences as a leader that I see God working in the lives of others before they see it. And stop and think about the number of conversations that you've had with people that someone will say to you, I think that I might want to, And you can fill in the blank with many different things there. Seek ordination, go on a missions trip, change jobs, ask her to marry me, whatever the case may be. You can fill in the blank in lots of different ways. And you've seen this coming because you've seen how God has been working in their life long before they ever wake up to it. And yes, I'm talking about people of faith. They're already on that journey, and yet there are parts of their life that God's grace is just beginning to become apparent to them and become visible to them. And so I find myself in those moments, with a wink in my eye, saying things like, "Oh, really?" Hadn't noticed. Of course you do. You've been testing those waters, in terms of, let's take the ordination example or leadership in the church. You've been leading in worship, you've been teaching classes, you've been inviting folks into community, you've been reaching out into the neighborhood. It's no surprise to me that you want to start a ministry with the people that you've been reaching out to. Those sorts of things that, as leaders, we provide the space and create the space for people to test out those questions, to explore what they're feeling and seeing, to be able to name how God is moving in their lives and how God is shaping them to be who they were created to be. To me, that's all God's prevenient grace at work.
I like the images that are coming to mind as you talk about that, but I'm also thinking that that I've experienced God's prevenient grace even in the midst of when I thought I was dispensing grace. One example, and I not to take too much time with the story, but when I lived in Peoria and we had ministries with people on the street, one of the persons that I had become acquainted with and developed a relationship with, his name was Dave. Dave came by the parking lot of the church one evening, and in my mind, because of what happened oftentimes just about dark in the parking lot at the church, he was begging for money and that he wanted something to eat. When he approached me and I spoke to him, he said he just wanted to talk with me. And I said, well, I don't have any money, but I can take you someplace to get you something to eat. And he said, I don't want anything to eat. I just want someone to talk with me. I said, well, get in the car and I'll take you to the restaurant to get something to eat. In that conversation, I mean, and because I thought I was the one who was now giving care to him, what I eventually found out, and I could tell more of that story, is that God was coming to me in a way that I was going to learn something through somebody on the street. Because all he wanted to do was have a conversation. He was going off to jail. He wanted to talk to somebody. He wanted to know that somebody would be around 30 days later when he got out of jail. He came to my office. I'm still trying to give him something to eat. He's saying, I don't need something to eat. I just need someone to be, and literally to be related to me. And so since I know more about it than he does, I try to get him something to eat. Finally, when it comes to a place where I have some work that can be done at my house, and I offer him a job because he says he'll work, I go by to pick him up one morning after he's let out from the Salvation Army. He's sitting on the wall at the church, and I'm saying, come on, let's go. And on the way, guess what I asked him? Would you like to get something to eat? And he said, you can stop by the convenience store. And so me being who I am and trying to do something good for him, when he goes in and gets a donut and some coffee, when he goes up to pay for it, I say, I'll get it for you. When we get to the car, he looks at me and he says, don't ever do that to me again. He said, I could have paid for it myself. As I've listened to what you've said, that was a moment of of great conviction, but it was a moment of preventing grace. Because all of my resistance to what God was trying to tell me in terms of developing a relationship with one of God's children, I kept trying to keep him at arm's distance because I knew exactly what he needed. He kept telling me what he wanted. I kept telling him what I thought he needed, until finally he said to me, you don't have to treat me like I'm not important. Now, I know that when we talk about, as leaders, when we talk about preventing and justifying, sanctifying grace, now at least I do, I sometimes think of it in a linear kind of way, that here, now that you've experienced this prevenient grace, and now you'll get to know God's love in a kind of saving kind of way, and then you'll get to become more who God intends you to be. I think it was the work of God's preventing grace that invited me into a little bit of sanctification at that moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think part of what I'm hearing you point to is that as you have journeyed, and we'll talk about this when we get to justifying grace, as you have journeyed in your relationship with Christ, simply because you have a relationship with Christ now doesn't mean that ongoing cycle of prevenient, justifying, and sanctifying grace isn't happening. That's the process of sanctification. That's the journey that we are on. The other thing that I'm hearing you point to, Tim, as a leader, is that sometimes the ways that I have found that I can best create a space for folks to be able to be open to God's grace is simply to listen. It's not to name it, but it's to listen, or to ask the questions that invite folks to pause and consider what's happening around them. I guess for me as a leader, I don't think it's my job to inform other people about how God's at work in their life. But I do think as a leader, it's my responsibility to be faithful in those moments, to listen, to ask the questions so that other people can explore God in their midst. And sometimes those tables get turned on us, and we're not in the position of leadership, but we're in the position of learning. And, those are the moments that I think God goes, wink, wink, gotcha on that one. Well, there'll be another opportunity. Let's keep moving forward.
One of the ways I've thought of it over years of ministry is that the preventing grace or prevenient grace is one way of improving the acoustics. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like helping others as well as ourselves to be able to hear, so to speak, hear God's voice, or to improve the arena in such a way that they can experience God's love. That's part of what I think of as prevenient grace.
Yeah, and the place that I probably saw that one happen over and over and over again was as a youth pastor with teenagers who are raw and real, and in places where, their parents sometimes were making them come to a ministry event, or their best friends brought them along, kind of like me when I was a child. And also the parents that struggled at times to see how God was working in their children's lives, because they had one vision for how their kids' lives would unfold, and their kids' lives weren't unfolding in that way. And sometimes it was nothing more than adolescent rebellion, and helping them to see that as a season of growth and development, and that yes, God was still there even in the midst of that adolescent rebellion. We all go through it, we all experience it. even when they weren't feeling, you can't see me right now, I'm making air quotes around the feeling, when they weren't feeling loved by whether it was their friends or their family members, because they weren't living up to something that they thought that they wanted. Helping to, again, the listening and the asking of the questions to help them see that in a different way. And sometimes it was just simple things of, oh, so God was present in that. And them coming to the place, and I would never force it, but usually there was a moment that they would say, okay, I can see it a little bit now. And giving them the opportunity to take one more step and one more step and one more step. And now many of those teenagers are parents themselves. Their kids aren't quite to the teenage years. But watching them now in that place, and I can see how God is working in their lives and in their children's lives and in their families' lives. We don't leave it behind. We don't graduate from Prevenient grace.
So, Sarah, another question that I have, and I've not always asked these questions because I've not always been in a place where I was thinking about them. So now that I'm thinking about it, I'm going to ask you. I think I know the answer to this, but because of the work that we do and what we're trying to do with LeaderCast, I want to ask the question, and that is, God's prevenient grace, as we're talking about it, or Wesley's, the way we're talking about it from a Wesleyan perspective, it's not really limited to religious jargon and church experience, or I mean, when we talk about faith, sometimes we limit that just to church. But it's not limited to that. This is this great and wonderful God who's created the universe, and this is the way God works with everyone, regardless of who they are, what they've done, what their faith might be. This is God. I mean, how many breaths have we taken since we started the podcast? I mean, did you get a call on your opinion of the sunrise this morning? I mean, this is God's grace.
Right.
And this is a kind of way in which it gets translated in the kind of ways we're talking about it now in terms of relationships and that, but just the idea that we can get up every morning.
Right.
It's pretty cool.
Right. And because I wasn't a person of faith as a teenager and moving into my young adult years, when I had an opportunity to go into some of our most beautiful, grand national parks around this country, and literally standing on a mountain that is at 12,000 feet in elevation and looking around me, I'm not thinking in that moment. Well, I was thinking in that moment, oh my gosh, this is beautiful, because it was just gorgeous. And it was, you were trying to take the pictures in your mind to capture what you were seeing, and you never could. And at that point in time, cell phones didn't have well, that's a whole nother story. The cameras that we had were the disposable cameras. And so you weren't able to get pictures of what you were seeing in a way that was ever going to be able to be translated to anyone else. And the question for me that kept coming up was, how can you have a heart beating inside of you and not see God in the midst of all that is happening here? How is that little animal that I have no idea what it is running across there at 12,000 feet? Should you even be here? And how are you alive? And why does the tree line all of a sudden stop? And a whole different formation happens. To me, there is no one else other than God who could be a part of that. And so I wasn't using the God language. I wasn't with a group of church people on those adventures. I was with college students. And yet those were the questions that I was asking. So maybe that's why I say God uses everything, because if God can use backcountry backpacking trips and adventures in 15-passenger vans across the country. Now, there were moments in that, and I said, "No, this is proof that there might not be a God." But in all seriousness, if God can use those moments, who am I to say that God can't use all things?
So you've alluded to it a couple of times, but now coming in regard to leadership again, how cool would it be that we're so aware not only of God's presence and grace, but just the presence of God in our own lives, that we could expect God to show up in people's lives that may not know it, understand it, God showing up in situations that we have no control over, and being able to identify that as a place in which our lives actually take a turn. That's really part of what we're talking about in being leaders and understanding prevenient grace, is helping people. And as we've done with so many things that we've done with Transforming Mission, is to try to help people experience, where have you seen God today?
Right.
In what relationship or what experience? And what I really like is that as people have responded to that, we're getting I think we're getting some traction of people seeing God in some simple, ordinary ways, but are very profound, because we begin to look for God in those moments.
Yes. That's my deep thought for.
That's what but that's what we're trying to do, and that's and it's not because we have some corner on it. It's just that how wonderful, how cool it is to be able to recognize. I mean, even in a conversation I had yesterday with somebody just asking the question about, I'm not really sure about a call to ministry. I'm not really sure what all that means. So there wasn't some kind of pat answer to go with that. It's the idea of, well, let's take this together and let's see where it takes us. It's allowing him to have the experience and then being able to say, maybe that's what God is like. And it's or letting him tell me what he thinks God's doing. Because who am I to say, well, that's God?
Might be that you ask the question, where's God? Where's God in the midst of that for you?
Yeah, that's our point.
Yeah, and so for me, as that journey of naming where you're seeing God every day, and I talk about it as following Jesus every day. We don't follow Jesus just on Sunday. We follow Jesus every single day. And so keeping our eyes and ears and heart open to where God might be moving in your midst. And often it's the simple things that, I don't know about you, Tim, but for me, when I go to articulate it, it doesn't quite have the same impact saying it out loud sometimes as it did in that moment of me seeing it and receiving it and noticing it. So, yeah. Anything else you want to say about Prevenient Grace?
Not today.
Let me remind you that you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/070. You'll find additional resources to help you deepen your relationship with Christ, the local congregation, and your surrounding community. Now go lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.